Hello friends. So you may have remembered me mentioning that the Children and Families Act that requires the local authority to make a special education provision for a child who has been identified as having special educational needs and requiring support with an EHCP. The law now has been changed by the Coronavirus Act that now says that the local authority have to make reasonable endeavours. Well, I personally think it's an outrage that the government has reopened schools for children with education, health and care plans, but has not restored their full rights. So I wanted to investigate this further, and I asked Ros Somerville and Helen from Essex County Council to explain to me what are reasonable endeavours, how have these been interpreted within Essex, and what can parents expect from their schools. So here we are today with another little conversation, and this time I'm joined by Ros Somerville and Helen from the local authority. Now, Helen, we can see that your name is up, but there's no picture of you. But I know that's because your webcam is not working. But would you just like to say who you are and what you do for everybody?
Hello, yes, I do apologise about the lack of camera. My name's Helen, and I work in the central team for the local authority in the strategy and innovation team. So I work with Ralph Holloway, and my job title is strategic lead for participation and inclusion.
I see. Okay, thanks for that explanation. And also your colleague Ros. Hello, Ros. Do you want to just say what you do?
Yes, so I'm the North East SEND Quadrant Manager, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Quadrant Manager for the North East, that's Colchester and Tendring. And that really means that I oversee the teams that work in schools. So we've got inclusion partners and educational psychologists that are working in schools to support school staff and children and families to get SEND provision right in schools. And then there's also the SEND operations team, and they're the team who oversee all statutory assessment related tasks, so education, health and care plans, the needs assessments and the annual review processes. I also have a county-wide role as the principal educational psychologist, so I have a strategic view across that service across the county.
Okay, well that's brilliant, thank you. So it was great that you could both take time out of your schedules to come and speak to me today. And what I wanted to talk about was obviously schools have reopened for some pupils. And all children now with an education, health and care plan are being offered a place at school. But what we know is that the Children and Families Act 2014 had identified that where a child has got special educational needs, has been identified as having special educational needs, and their needs are being supported with an education, health and care plan, that the local authority must make a provision for them. And that the Coronavirus Act 2020 now has amended that to say that where a child has been identified with special educational needs and requires support through an education, health and care plan, the local authority must now make reasonable endeavours. So obviously that's a little bit of a woolly title, and I've done a lot of clicking around. I can't see any actual legal definition anywhere of it. I think there's a few teams of lawyers around the country that have tried to describe what it might look like, but I was just wondering if you could maybe say something about what does reasonable endeavours mean, and what that might mean for families.
Sure. So yes, you're quite right. The government have put in a notice to modify the Children and Families Act, Section 42 of the Children and Families Act, which specifically relates to the local authority's duty to secure the provision in an education, health and care plan. So it's a duty on the local authority has been relaxed to take account of the impact that coronavirus may have had. It isn't to release us from that duty at all, and it isn't to say that we would stop wanting to make the provision as set out in the education, health and care plan. It's just acknowledging that schools, local authorities, health bodies may be having to work differently at the moment because of the coronavirus. So in some ways it's also there to ensure that people aren't just saying, well, there's a coronavirus, we can't do anything. It is there to say we must still use our reasonable endeavours, whatever is possible now with the coronavirus. We must make sure we're doing that. What we've done in Essex in response to this reasonable endeavours modification is we are looking to work with our schools, colleges and settings, and in some circumstances directly with families, to take a very individualised approach, and this is what the government is asking us to do, to work very individually with families to co-produce a reasonable endeavours plan, which is really around looking specifically at section G and F of the Education, Health and Care Plan. So what provision should we be making? What provision should schools be making now? Should the local authority be making sure happens now, usually? And what is possible now? And what are the barriers to putting that provision in now? And how can we together work with schools, settings and colleges to remove those barriers? If that's possible, we should. Schools have always been available for children with education and health care plans if it's safe. More children are going back in. We want to continue to work around reasonable endeavours, whether children are in school or at home. If children are at home, it might be difficult for some of the provision they would normally receive in school to be available. So we're asking schools to look at what they can do differently and modify that provision and still meet the need. So we have deployed our own staff. I talked in my, when I introduced myself, about education psychologists and inclusion partners. And we have trained up all of our inclusion partners and EPs, educational psychologists, to be able to support schools, to work with families, to think about what reasonable endeavours would look like, what alternatives might be possible now in the current circumstances, in the context the family and the school find themselves. We've also produced guidance and training for schools, and we've produced some materials that schools can use. And we want all of our schools and settings and colleges to have direct individual conversations with families of children with education, health and care plans, to work through each of the points and think about what is possible now and where they might need some help, to come back to the local authority to ask for that support in terms of what we could do differently now, to try and meet the needs really of children with EHCPs.
Yeah, so that's a huge amount of information that you've just shared there. Thank you for that. Well, I just want to just clarify a couple of things for people watching. So obviously you've said something there about how you thought about how these reasonable endeavours could be implemented. So you're talking very much about sitting at County Hall, you're thinking about what structures are going to be needed in order for schools to be able to make these reasonable endeavours. And you talked there about deploying your teams of educational psychologists and inclusion partners. And am I right in saying that inclusion partners are the team who were previously employed as specialist teachers?
Some of them are, yes. So some of the team members who are inclusion partners now were historically specialist teachers, and some are new into the local authority and new into the role, and so wouldn't have had that role previously.
Yeah, I see. And so what is the job role then? What is the sort of outcomes that you expect an inclusion partner to be working towards?
So the inclusion partner are allocated to early years settings and schools and colleges, and they are there to support the strategic direction of the local authority, which is to try and intervene early for children with special educational needs, to ensure that we are working with schools and colleges and settings to apply the Code of Practice, to adhere to the requirements within the SEN Code of Practice and the Children and Families Act. So Chapter 5, 6 and 7, early years settings, schools and colleges of the Code of Practice asks for us to be identifying children, working through SEN support, identifying those children who might need an EHCP, Education, Health and Care Plan. And inclusion partners are there to really support schools to implement the Code of Practice. We call it one planning in Essex, to ensure that this assess, plan, do review process is done in a person-centred way, to look at what provision schools have and put into place for children, both individually and collectively across cohorts, across year groups, and to work with schools to develop that provision, really, to develop their practice and develop the provision together.
Thanks, yeah, thank you for that. So what I can hear from that is that there are members of the local authority team sort of out and about in the various different areas and clusters working to try to check that reasonable endeavours are being made.
In terms of reasonable endeavours, they will be directly contacting their schools. They'll be we're calling it a key contact. There are other members of the Education Directorate that will be also key contacts for different settings as well. So our early years teams around reasonable endeavours. We've got Children Missing Education team are working with families and young people around reasonable endeavours, and the inclusion partners and educational psychologists will be working with schools in Essex to be the key contact, where they can collate the information, send the reasonable endeavours plans back into the local authority. They will then look at those. They're point of contact if they've got any questions or they come up against any different difficulties or differences, as we're calling it. So there might be difficulties thinking about how we're going to make the provision, or there might be differences about what people consider to be reasonable.
I see. So that's very much sort of on the ground. And you also mentioned earlier about information and support, what have you, for schools. So can you just say something about what information and guidance has been provided to schools for around reasonable endeavours?
Certainly, yes. So we produced some training, a PowerPoint training with a voiceover that's been available for schools to access. We sent it directly to them, and a whole suite of paperwork, which we have put together in light of our understanding on how we've read the reasonable endeavours, the modifications to the law. And we are asking schools to look at the training and to look at the paperwork. We're very mindful, we want to make sure the focus stays on the child and young person, and it isn't, we don't want lots of time spent on unnecessary paperwork. So if schools have already done some good paperwork, done some good work through their risk assessments and their welfare calls and are addressing some of this, we aren't requiring schools to use their paperwork. We want them to look at it, cross-reference with what they've got, use ours if they think that's better, make sure whatever they're using addresses the key points. We've also provided schools with drop-ins. So we've used the wonderful new technology like we're using now to enable schools. We ran 3 sessions before half term, 8 till 9, and then we've done another 4. Well, we will have done another 4 by the end of this week, where SENCO Special Educational Needs Coordinators can come and join myself and Helen, ask any questions, any points of clarification they want, having looked at the training, having read the guidance. So
what we've heard so far is your ideas and thoughts from County Hall about what this should look like. You've obviously provided training and support for schools, and that's sort of an ongoing thing. And then you've got teams on the ground to monitor what's happening. So there's lots of good processes in there to try to make sure those reasonable endeavours happen. So so Helen, I just wondered if you could say something about what the reasonable endeavours plans should look like.
So I think probably the easiest way, maybe if I were to talk about it as what a family may expect, what would be expected to happen, and take you through, as Ros just mentioned, there's 6 steps that a family could expect. So the first step in the process is what we've titled share. And the share step is all about providing families with the information they need around what does reasonable endeavours mean for me and for my child's education, health and care plan. So as was mentioned, we worked with the Essex Family Forum to develop a few handouts, leaflets, pieces of information that we've shared with all schools and asked them to share it with their families directly. And that included a letter from Claire Kershaw, the director, and then had some key points and key messages about the modifications to the law. And it also has a sheet that I'm sure hopefully many of your families will have seen, called Making a Reasonable Endeavours Plan During COVID-19, which sets out for families exactly what they can expect to happen, who would call them, what the conversation would be about, how they could plan for that and think about that, and places they could go for independent support and advice should they wish to. The second step is what we've called the Explore. And the Explore is really the part of reasonable endeavours which is about co-producing and talking with families and really understanding what their situation is at home at the moment. Individual circumstances can differ hugely. We know a lot of families are under huge pressure. Have to also take into consideration at that time what's equally reasonable and possible for the school. And the third step is then the agree. So it's thinking about 5 questions: the what, the where, the how, the who, and the when. So what can we all agree would seem reasonable at the moment to support you and your child that we can deliver, and how would we do it following those 5 questions? And setting it out for a family and a young person in a way that is possible and doesn't add any more stress at this time to anybody. Fourth step is to record that. So this isn't about paperwork. This isn't about producing 8 sides of beautifully documented paperwork, but making sure that families do have a record of that, because it's quite difficult sometimes in a phone call, especially if you're trying to look after a child in the background, to listen and take on every point. So making sure there's clarity there, and families understand what can be provided at the moment and what can't. The fifth step is about giving families and young people and schools the opportunity to highlight anywhere where they feel there's a difference of opinion, or there's a difficulty, or the impact of something not being provided is causing a real concern to them. So that's an opportunity for schools to contact their key contact, and for families, we've set up a family survey with the Essex Family Forum that families and young people can complete online to share their experiences of this process, how it's worked for them, how they would like to see it changed or improved. And then the last step, as would always be, is the review. So making sure that everybody knows how we're going to review these plans, when we're going to review the plan. And really the crucial thing at this point for any family is to know how to call for it to be reviewed, because if your circumstances change at home for whatever reason, the date that you may be agreed in a conversation would be a good date to have a review. Maybe it needs to be sooner if things change for you.
Yeah, so that sounds like a really comprehensive plan. I just wanted one other question about review there, Helen. The review, how do you see that happening? Do you see that as an informal telephone conversation, or do you see that as actually a more formalised meeting like you would have in the annual cycle of school review process anyway?
I think we'd be thinking about it more as a conversation at this point. I think annual reviews are continuing. So if your child is due an annual review, it may happen in a different way, but the annual review will still continue. And this we would see more as being, we'd want conversations to happen more frequently. I know a lot of the feedback we've had from the family forum from different families is that keeping in touch and having that regularity of conversation feels a lot more reassuring.
Yeah, that for sure.
We have been asked that by schools about reviews and about the timescales, and the guidance doesn't really give us much information about that. But what we've sort of gone with is that the government's reviewing it on a monthly basis. So actually we should at least be reviewing those reasonable endeavours plans on a monthly basis. That's really what the review's got to be around, is what's changed since the last time we talked about what is possible now. And I think in that in those steps Helen talked about, when we talked about the what, the where, the how, the when and the by whom, the what is very much referencing back to what is in the plan and what can we do now and what might we need to do differently and what won't we be able to do, and is there anything we can supplement that with, as well as is there anything new that might have emerged as a consequence of the coronavirus that we actually weren't having to contend with before, but actually now that's the priority, or that's something we need to think about together. We haven't really addressed the summer holiday business. Obviously we don't quite know what will happen over the summer holidays, so we'll wait to see around that, but this certainly isn't to replace an annual review. We have sort of talked about it perhaps being in lieu of one planning. It's sort of what the family meetings you might otherwise have had with schools, which we might have called one planning meetings with an education, health and care plan to think about how things are going. This is sort of bridging the gap over one planning, but certainly not replacing annual reviews.
Yeah, okay, that's super helpful, thank you. So, you know, I'm sitting here obviously listening to what you folks at the local authority have been doing and beavering away with, and of course I'm thinking very much about what does that look like from parents and carers' perspective. So, you know, what I can hear from you is that obviously thought very deeply about reasonable endeavours, thought very deeply about how can we make sure that every child, as much as possible, is going to get their full entitlement that is set out in the Education, Health and Care Plan. Obviously you've put training and support in place for schools, you've made it very clear what your expectation is, you've got teams on the ground there that you've described to monitor and implement that. But, you know, one of the things that the parent carer community know about what's been happening in Essex over the last 15, 20 years is that the outcomes often are not a good reflection of often lots of hard and good work that's been going on at County Hall, and that just makes me wonder, you know, within this, if parents are not feeling happy that their school has made reasonable enough endeavours, they're dissatisfied with that provision in any way, what would you advise families to do? How can families actually have some say in this process?
Well, we have tried to ensure that there is that direct dialogue for families back to the local authority, and in the letter that families should have been sent by the school or setting that their child attends, there is a link to the survey, and that's the route by which we would encourage parents to have that direct contact with us. And we, as Helen says, we want to know when it's going well, and we definitely want to know where parents feel that it hasn't gone well. We have asked schools to try and help us with that and tell us where they feel that there's a difference between opinion between schools and families as well, and ask for us to intervene as early as possible. And certainly the survey is the direct route through which families can communicate with us. Some families will be having direct contact with educational psychologists or inclusion partners or other members of the local authority if their child is not in an Essex maintained school. So that means obviously schools that are in Essex, geographically in Essex, and are academy schools or not academy schools but are Essex schools, we are linking with the schools and asking them to work with the families. Then we have other families where their children go to schools maybe in Southend, so they're mainstream schools or a special school in Southend. Now we are working with those schools as well, just to be clear that we're working with Southend schools and Suffolk schools and Hertfordshire schools, Redbridge schools. If your child's got an education help and care plan, you live in Essex, but your child goes to a Redbridge school or Suffolk school, we're working with the school. And then we have some families whose children go to schools all over the country. They're called independent schools, where they're not mainstream schools, they are special schools, and they're not local authority schools or academies. They are independent, and we're working directly with some of the families there as well, so they've got a direct voice in with us there. But the survey is there for the majority of families to have that feedback loop to us.
Yeah, so my question there is really around where you have educational psychologists and inclusion partners and the other members of the team that you mentioned working with schools in their local clusters. Is that a support that's there for schools, or are they having also contact with families? And if yes, if local families are dissatisfied, do they have an opportunity to have a conversation with the educational psychologists and inclusion partners?
So at the moment, we are working with reasonable endeavours. We haven't really necessarily taken a cluster approach to it. We're taking individual school approach. So as an education psychologist and inclusion partner, you'll have a list of schools that are your responsibility to make sure that you know that they've got the information that we expect them to have, they understand their role in this and how we would like them to report back to us and what we can do to support them. So we're not taking so much of a cluster approach to it for reasonable endeavours. When we are working with clusters, the cluster model is about bringing the school staff together. We have, as part of our redesign, which we went live on the 1st of January, didn't get that long to implement it prior to the world changing. We have got a new role of engagement facilitators, which are part of the structure. They are about working directly with families in a more dedicating time to working with families. A lot of IP work, I talked about them implementing the SEND code of practice. They'll also be looking at upskilling the workforce in schools. So a lot of training, there's a lot of training involved in what they will be doing. And again, they may work directly with families on an individual basis. We have the Educational Psychology Service Parent Helpline, which runs on a Monday afternoon during term time, 1 till 5 every Monday. Now that is somewhat a helpline for parents to be able to call to have a consultation with an educational psychologist and talk about what difficulties they might be having either at home or with school in terms of meeting their child's needs. It isn't a referral. It won't get you an EP to come out and do an assessment, but it will give you an opportunity to talk to an EP. We do it as a confidential and anonymous line, so you might talk about your school, but we don't need to know the name of the school. We would then help you think about how we might help you move that situation forward. Obviously, we've got our SEND Navigators team. They used to be known as the Parent Partnership team. Information, guidance and support team for families with children with SEND. And they're available. They have a helpline as well that parents can call. We also have 2 roles. Helen, would you like to talk about our SEND Navigator roles?
Yes. So we have before this all began with regional endeavours and obviously coronavirus, we were working to our inspection findings, and some conversations with our health partners and social care partners were highlighting that for families it's very difficult when you first enter the world of SEND, maybe, and it's a very new world. There's a whole new language, and there are a lot of support. There's a lot of support out there for families, but sometimes it can be very difficult to navigate that and find their way through it. And our health partners, many GP services now have a GP navigator, which is a specific role that can just point you, exactly as it sounds, with navigation, point you in the right direction. And we were wondering whether or not there is a role, whether that's an actual role or it's a function or it's a virtual role, to have SEND navigators who really understand what's available and out there to support families in all 3 areas, so in social care, in health and in education. So we have 2 people this year who are sort of looking into that role, doing some investigation around it, working with families and groups to understand what would be useful for them, to make some recommendations at the end of the year.
They have also been posting quite a lot on the local offer Facebook group to give parents a direct email address to contact the local authority as well.
But it does make me think that returning to school is likely to be a large cohort of quite traumatised children. I mean, I've been supporting families whose young people are petrified about germs and bacteria leaving their house. And of course, I know that there will have been some significant mental health and well-being impacts for many families out there, many of whom I'm speaking to. And Ros, you shared with me some information about the Essex Family Support Service, which I think looks great, and I can share the links to all that with people through social media. Do you want to just say something about that?
I really would, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. I think we are, when we were talking about earlier about the what's in the plan, what provision is being made and what to meet the needs as identified in the Education Health Year Plan, of course, we're very mindful there might be new needs, and some of that might relate, exactly as you say, to mental health and emotional well-being. And for some families, that would also be around bereavement and loss. And so we have worked on developing resources and support for our schools around bereavement and loss and around mental health and emotional well-being. There's a lot of research and we're being told, I think Bath University has recently just published something to say this is going to have a profound impact, which is going to extend over a number of years. So we are working with our schools now to prepare them to support children as they go back and ensure they have opportunity for play and for reconnecting with their peers, and that we must ensure that we look after their emotional wellbeing and mental health, as well as focusing on their learning. Then there's the Essex Family and Children Family Wellbeing Service have also, working with a voluntary partnership, 360 I think they're called, have directly in relation to coronavirus put in some additional support, which I think that's the links I sent to you. So where families and young people can self-refer in. Of course, we've got our emotional wellbeing mental health service, that's UMS. Other local authorities might call that child and adolescent mental health services, CAMS. We call it UMS in Essex. And again, that service is still running and referrals can be made into their self-referrals. Young people can refer themselves in, as well as through GPs and families. So we are taking that responsibility very seriously. We've provided resourcing for schools around loss and bereavement as well. And there's I think I also sent you the link to the Essex County Council website, which has a page on staying healthy, and there are some very useful links in there for people to get either think about what they can be doing to support their children, as well as how they might be able to get some additional supporting if that's needed.
Well, great. Well, thanks for that. And actually, one of the things that has come out of having to work in this very different way is that I've been doing lots of interviews with different organisations and individuals and learned so much myself about what's available and what's out there. Mm-hmm. So it's been great to have you share that information with me today so that we can share this on with other families. Hopefully we can carry on having a conversation as the weeks and months go by and be able to monitor that things are moving in the right direction and reasonable endeavours have turned out to be something that has worked well.
We would very much hope that to be the case, and we do request that people let us know where it isn't working so well so that we can intervene to improve it, because we really are passionate about trying to make a difference on people, particularly now. So.
Well, thank you both very much for your time today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to speak to me.
Our pleasure, thank you.
Thanks.
Lovely to speak to you.
There was a lot of information in that conversation that I had there with Ros and Helen. And I really got the sense that there's been an awful lot of hard work behind the scenes to make absolutely sure that reasonable endeavours are made for each and every child. I know that Ros and Helen are seeing this as an opportunity to meet the needs of every individual child and make sure that the provision is at least as good as the provision set out in their education, health and care plan. However, what we know from history is that lots of hard work and good intentions from County Hall don't always translate into good outcomes for children. In fact, history has shown that they rarely do. So now more than ever, it's important that you feed back your experiences. So your child's school should have been in touch with you to start the process of the 6-point Reasonable Endeavours plan that Helen described. They should have done that by June the 12th. So if you have not heard back from your school by today, get in touch with them and you must let the local authority know. This is the only way that we're going to make sure that our children get the entitlement that they deserve through this process. Hope that helps. I'll be back again with another video for you very soon.